Hi and welcome back to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. Now, as you may or may not know, I have a bit of a thing for dragonflies, and a couple of years ago I made these beaded wire dragonflies with you, and naturally enough, because it's me, I put them onto a giant great big copper tiara. So yeah, I do love dragonflies, but what I wanted to do for today's tutorial is bring you a much more simplified variation. So you can add beads if you want to, but the basics we're going to work towards is a lovely wire dragonfly such as this one. I'll also show you how to make a little stick pin or a hat pin. Now these can be used as brooches, or you can add them onto fascinators and beautiful wedding hats, especially if you're going down a slightly more alternative route. Here's one that I've just very simply added a couple of beads on the tips of the wings. They can be as simple or as complicated and glittery as you wish them to be. Let's head down to the board and take a slightly closer look at what we're going to work on today. So here's a couple of examples, the type of thing that you can make from today's tutorial: a simplified wire dragonfly with or without beads, and I've attached mine onto stick pins, so you can use cinema or add them into your beautiful wedding collection, whatever you want to do with them really. I really enjoyed making the slightly more complex ones, but now we have got a slightly simpler set. I don't know what the collective noun for dragonflies is, so I'm just going to go with here's a pair of dragonflies. So to make these, I'm going to be working with 3 gauges of wire today. 1mm, which is 18 gauge, 0.8mm, which is 20 gauge, and 0.4mm, which is 26 gauge. So let's just pop the naked dragonfly up in the corner there so we can refer back to it and make a start. So to begin with, I'm going to work with 1mm or 18 gauge wire, and I have around about a 10-inch length here to start with. If you want a significantly larger dragonfly, you'll obviously need to size that up, but the chap that I've got just here, probably around about 3 or 3.5 inches across his wingspan. So that's a perfectly reasonably visible size of dragonfly to work with. Now you'll see that I'm giving the wire a little bit of a warm, and that's just because I want it to be nice and fluid. So we're looking to find the halfway point. Now I am notorious for not measuring and just eyeballing it, which means that I generally end up not quite in the centre. You could measure it if you wanted to. Now you'll notice what I'm doing here is I'm making a little U-shaped bend down at the base, and I have completely missed the mark there, but I'm not worried, I've got enough wire to play with. I don't really want that to completely close up just yet, so you don't need to worry about that being perfect. You could use a pair of round nose pliers if you prefer, just to get that loop shape down at the base. I'm just going to close that up ever so slightly, but not completely shut that away. Now we do want this to be reasonably firm, so in a moment you will have the option to just apply a little bit of hammering to work hard, and this section of the design makes it slightly easier at the next juncture. So just to make life easier, I am going to trim away with the flush side to make sure that I now have a completely centralised base section down here. And what I'm going to do now is to create the little, I want to say antenna, but I'm not really an expert in such things, and we're going to use the tip of the round nose pliers to create a couple of little 1.5 turn coils, one going one way and then the opposite direction, one going the other way. Now ideally these should be around about the same sort of dimension, around about the same finishing point with those little cut ends, but it's not really super important. Nobody's going to be testing you on your anatomy today. So let's just close those up so that they look a little bit similar. I'm not going to freak out. Now I quite like the idea of having a little bit of a gap between them at the top, but the rest of that strand of wire, we've got a gap down here by the U-shaped section, and we've got a little bit of an opening just up at the top here where those antennae are. I'm just going to give that a nice squish to get a head start on setting those shapes so that they're good and strong, and then I want to just rub my thumb and forefinger over the design to get that nice and fluid. Make sure I'm happy with how that's all sitting before I grab a mini block and a teeny tiny hammer. So I don't particularly mind marking the wire. What you may notice if you are a bit of an enthusiast of dragonflies, as I am, is that there are certain segments along the length of the main body. So if you do mark the wire at this stage, just say you meant to do it. and that it is relevant to the particular type of dragonfly that you're working for. So once you've got a really good, nice straight line, we're looking for the central section of this to be nice and parallel and touching. It really helps us out later if we do. I've left a little bit of a gap up at the top. Just giving that a little bit of work hardening as it helps us out during the next section in just a moment. So let's get the tools back out of the way and then we can move on to the next bit. Probably just knock things flying. Just really not a me video unless I do, to be honest with you. So there we go, we've got a little bit more strength here now, and a good way to test if it's enough is just to kind of press a thumb against that. If it's not terribly willing to move, then that is all well and good. Now you can play around with how these little antennas sit later on. I've got an extra little example here where I've bent the body back and up, and I've just slightly tilted the coiled sections of those antennae. It's not particularly accurate if you are whatever the person is that looks at dragonflies. I don't know if he's a lepidopterist or what he is, but there we go. I don't think it's particularly accurate, but I think it looks cute. So you've got lots of options on how this can play out. For the next part of creating our dragonfly, we're going to be working with 0.8mm wire. And that is equivalent approximately to 20 gauge. Now I am, as always, working with soft raw copper, and that's one of the reasons it helps just to give a little bit of work hardening along the top sort of half of this section of your design, because it's great to work with soft wire, but sometimes it's less great. So I'm going to start down at one end of this wire, and I don't particularly want to overwork this. It does need to be fluid, so I'm just going to grab one end and give that a couple of sweeps with the thumb and forefinger just to get a little bit of fluidity in there. And then we're going to start winding my 0.8 or 20 gauge around the form of the body that we've already created. Now I'm going to start maybe 1.5 inches from one end, and I'm going to start laying that over the top of the form, quite close to those antennae. And what I want to do is just to wrap around, and I'm going to put that all the way around once to begin with. And what I'd like to happen here is for these to be nice and flat. Let's just move the sticky pointy end away from me, because I am the world's clumsiest. As you can probably see, if you've ever looked at my hands, there's usually scars on them. So what I'd like to do is to flatten down that first wrap. Now it goes all the way around both sides of that little body frame, and I'm going to give that a squish. And I know I'm always saying don't press down where wire crosses over wire. Today we're going to do exactly that. So once I've given that just a teeny tiny squish, I'm going to continue wrapping the cut end up towards the antenna. If you know what they're called, don't hesitate to tell me in the comments below. I really don't mind being educated. So I've gone for 4 wraps at the moment. I'm just going to tighten those coils up and make sure that I'm happy with them and flatten them down. Now this is one of the reasons it really does help us out if we do a little bit of work hardening at this stage. So a couple of more squishes just here. Bring the tail all the way around, trying your hardest not to deform the central body part as we're going, and I quite like to have around about 7 wraps all in all up at the top end, but there are no rules because these are your dragonflies. If you decide that you want to use them as earrings, for instance, and you want them to be identical, you will need to obviously count how many wraps you get around this end so that you can replicate it. Now this is going to be the underside because it's where the wire is finishing off. So in order for that to look neat from the front, I'm just going to elevate that wire slightly, if I show you that from above. And I'm going to trim that with the flush side of those cutters. Let's pop that over in the scrap pot, just so that the very last section sits hidden away on the rear of my design. At the moment we're looking at the rear side, so I'm going to give that a really hearty squish now, making those good solid wraps, and it might move just a little bit, but ideally we want that to become static. So we're putting a little bit of a good tension as we're wrapping around, which again is why it does pay to give that a little bit of work hardening. So let's flip this over to the action side. This is the end we're going to be looking at, the side we're going to be looking at rather. And what I've noticed is that there's a tiny bit of bagging in that coil, so I will give that a bit of a squish and a squeeze just to ensure that I'm happy with how that looks. Now, because I've only got 5 visible wraps, I want to do a couple more around. That's 1 and that's 2. And we are looking on the upper side, which is going to be the design side we'll see, and I'm just going to give that a lovely little squish. You can take a lot more time to make sure that those wraps are beautifully neat. What we're going to do next is straighten and warm the wire that's coming over to one side. Now, if you're working in the opposite direction, it doesn't really matter. At this stage, what we're looking to have is the wire coming away from on top of the form with the cut end underneath hidden away and really, really smoothed flat. So it's not going to get caught in anybody's hair or ruin anybody's hat. What we're looking to do is to have things look as beautiful as possible. I'm going to pinch and smooth a good couple of times here. Now for this next section, you can use bail making pliers, or you can use a high-tech tool such as a pen, whatever makes you happy. Let's have a look. Size-wise, I think probably around about here is going to be ideal. If you've got a round dowel, you can use that. If you've got a mandrel that comes down small enough, do feel free to use that. Or as I mentioned before, you can use your bail making pliers. So let's just wrap the wire carefully around the first wing, and then retract your tool of choice out of the way. And what we're looking for is to have that nice and flat. Now, the distance that we've travelled, we will need to replicate in a moment. So if you wanted to grab a piece of scrap wire to measure this, or if you want to go for a specific distance, then grab a ruler, whatever works for you. I, as always, am going to eyeball it. So to ensure that this wing stays set, I'm just going to push it up. If I put this in the flat, you'll see that we've created a nice circuit down at the base there, as if you've gone round the roundabout, you've come back on yourself. And what I'm looking for is to have a straight line returning to the body of our wee beastie, which means that the upper side of the wing is coming up and away at an angle. So if I grip that in my non-dominant hand, I'm going to wrap all the way around the body. If I bring the wire underneath, tension into it, and then pull it back. So this may pull your wing down a little bit, and you'll just need to give that a tiny little bit of a wiggle to get it to sit where you want it to. So what we've done is we've formed a ring around our very high-tech tool, the pen, and then we have wrapped once around this dual-tracked body section. Give it a squish, and then what we're going to do is exactly the same thing on the other side. We have just wrapped once all the way around both of those central body wires. Let's bring the high-tech tool back into position. I'm working with quite a long section of wire today, just in case you wanted a much larger wingspan. So let's just make sure that that's nice and smooth, and then you can push the wire around. Now, one of the things that often happens here is that you can see immediately one of these sides is not quite the same distance as the other. So what I tend to do is half create that little pear drop shape, and then I can pop my beautiful tool back into position and just rotate it away if I need to make it slightly larger. Now we're returning the wire from the top of the body around the little end section to the top of the body, and we're doing the exact same thing on this side now. So I'm just going to push again up to ensure that I have the same distance between the body and the end of that wing. I think I need to take that just a tiny bit further out. Like I say, you could use a ruler or a scrap piece of wire. Let's just rotate that ever so slightly away. That looks pretty good to me. Such a long piece of wire, it's hitting the lighting array, obviously. So once you're happy with the size of your upper set of wings, and if you need to make it smaller, let me just show you how to make it smaller. You just rotate in the opposite direction, and the wire, because you spent some time warming it, will obey you. So once you're happy that your upper 2 wings are equal and opposite to each other, please don't worry overly much about the fact that one wing is ever so slightly higher than the other. By the time you've popped this into your fabulous designs, it simply won't matter. It's a design. It's not the technical drawing of an actual dragonfly. So let's pinch that down into position. What I'm going to do now is wrap another 7 times around just the body. Now I'm just going for 7 at the top and then 7 between the wing sets because it's easy for me to remember. You can choose whatever number of wraps around the body part you'd like to go for. So that's 1 wrap and 2 wraps. Now you can see that these are loose at the moment, so in order to tighten everything up, I'm just going to put one side of my pliers at the top and one side at the bottom and just bring that up tightly and neatly before giving that a hearty squish to make sure that everything is staying put. Now if I show you the rear side of this, it's probably a little bit baggy, and you can certainly take a little extra time if you wish to just straighten and tighten. It will give you a much neater finish if you take those extra seconds during the process. So let's wrap around another 4 times. That's 1 of 4, 2 of 4, 3 of 4 and 4 of 4. So we've got 7 wraps now between the upper wing set and where we have just landed. And I'm going to ensure that I'm happy with these wraps, keeping everything nice and strong. I'm putting quite a lot of pressure. If you struggle with grip strength, you can put the design on the table, use the table to help you. Give that a bit of a squish to make sure that you're happy. And then for the lower wing set, what I tend to do, where we had straight lines on the undersides of the wings, you can just play around with them slightly if you wish to afterwards. So you can move them about slightly, and you can also just open them up a tiny amount if that helps you, if you want to do that, just to get a nice even look. Whatever makes you happy, you have got the capacity to just move that ever so slightly. What we're going to do now is go for a second set of wings. Let's give that a smooth through. Again, I'm making sure that that's nice and warm. My wire is coming away. If I put this in the true to 12 o'clock, I'm going to bring that out directly in a straight line towards that 3 o'clock position. Doesn't matter if you're working in the opposite and you're going over to the 9 o'clock, as long as your wire's travelling from the top of the body to the top of the body. So let's grab that tool again and create a second wing. You can go for them being exactly the same size if you wish to. I've even created weird alien dragonflies with 3 wing sets, wings that cross over the top of one another. Whatever you want to do, it's fantasy art at the end of the day. So let's rotate that wire around the outside of the pen, bringing the wire back to the top side of the body. Now I like to see 2 different sizes. You can do whatever you want. You can take inspiration from nature and look what real dragonflies have an assembly like if you wish to. So once I've got that basic wing shape, I'm going to pinch again and then wrap all the way around the body 1 time and bring the wire back across the top. Once that's set, we're going to give it a squish, and then you will finish off by creating an equal and opposite wing and then going for as many wraps as you desire down the body. I finished off my little simple wire dragonfly with a second wing made in exactly the same way as we did on the upper set. I finished off by, I just used the rest of the wire that I had available, that 0.8 or 20 gauge wire. I just kept wrapping around the section of the body that we'd pre-hardened with the hammering, and making sure that I cut away on the underside. So the 2 cut ends of that 0.8 or 20 gauge wire are hidden away underneath. What I'm going to show you now is how you can add just a little bit of finesse to the design, make it look a little bit more dragonfly-y, a little bit more 3D, and then we'll crack on with making a basic hat pin or stick pin. So in order to bring our flat dragonfly to life, there's a number of things that you can do. So what I like to do is to bring the tail up. Again, I'm not a specialist in insects. Genuinely have no clue if this is what they're like. I just think in my wire art, I like how it looks. So I'm going to very, very gently put a little bit of curvature on the end of the tail. I'm also going to put some curvature on the wing tips, but I'm going to do that in a slightly different way. So again, using that super high-tech tool, I'm going to roll the end of those wing tips just around the top of a pen, and you get this lovely little slightly elevated feel to the design. And because I'm working with raw copper, it really does shine. Now, something else that you can do, if you've managed to misshape your wire at all, you can just use a flat or chain nose set of pliers. I'm using bent chain nose pliers as always, just to reform any of those shapes. It's also at this stage that if you wish to, you can lay across a section of finer gauge wire and add some beads. So I've wrapped 5 times around one side, put the wire through the bead 5 times around the other side, and I've put the beads on top of the frame so that they show most of all, in so much as when I add the fine wire to set the beads, it goes from across the top to across the top. It does make sense when you get to doing that. So that's an option for you. Let's show you some more things you can do to your little wire dragonfly. So he's got a little bit of curvature on his tail, and he's got some elevated wingtips there as well. If you wanted to play around with the antenna, again, I don't know what they're actually called. What I'm going to do is, first of all, I'll show you that sideways, just bring them upwards, put a tiny gentle bend in there as well, just so that they're slightly elevated. The whole thing in the body, I'm going to put a bend in as well, but very, very gently. What I will do once I've got the elevation in those little coils is tilt them slightly. Now again, this is not based on reality, it's based on what I think looks good. So you've got a little bit of a lift in those coils, it just makes them sit a little bit more proud, catches the light. And again, if you wished to, you could take some very tiny seed beads and pop them in here, just to give it a little bit of an extra buzz. In the next section, I'll show you how you can make your own stick pin or hat pin. These can also be used as brooches. I'm going to show you how to make a very sharp point on some slightly hardened wire. Now, this can be a little bit on the pointy side, so definitely not for use by younger people or those with lesser physical movement capacity. Do be careful. I would also urge, when you're cutting wire in this fashion, to use eye protection, or at least a pair of glasses, just to make sure that you don't get pinged in the eyeball with an offcut, because it's very, very nasty when that happens. So let's head down to the board and make our very own stick pins. So for a simple stick pin like this, I would say if you possibly can, use 1.25mm, which is equivalent approximately to 16 gauge. They are really nice and hard wearing already. However, the larger gauge of wire that you use for a stick pin, the larger the hole it makes in the fabric. So it's always a bit of a trade-off. You can have them being stronger by having heavier wire, but it also is slightly more destructive. So you will need to confer with a client dependent on how you're going to proceed with that. So to make my stick pin, I've got around about 11 or 12 inches of 1mm or 18 gauge wire. I'm just going to make sure that the end I'm working with to begin with has a flush cut, and then I'm going to give that a little bit of a warming through. So let's just get that super toasty. I'm going to make this floral coil design. Very, very simple. I'm sure I made a pendant with some beads like it a little while ago, so you can always check that back in my history if you wish to. But I'm going to start with round nose pliers, getting a coil or a little loop going, and I'm going to go around twice to begin with, like so. Now, the more elaborate you want the head of your stick pin to be, the more wire you will need to allow. I'm going for simple and short today. If you want a particularly elongated wire, or you want to make one that is curved, which is quite common with hat pins, then you will need to adjust up the length of wire. I'm going to make something quite simplistic today. So I've got my little coil to begin with, and I'm just going to push away ever so slightly so that I have the wire coming away from that central coil. I'm then going to grab with the tip of my bent chain nose pliers and just bring that wire back down towards that central coil. And I'm going to repeat the same process several times. Now, you can take a lot more time to make these super even, make sure that they're all exactly the same size. You can get slightly more refined angles if you take time. I'm going to move through quite quickly because I'm aware that I do tend to go on quite a lot in my videos. So just going to push the wire backwards and forwards to make this little sort of starburst spiral section. And I'm looking to have the dips quite close to that central coil. And then these little sort of fluted, they could be petals, it could be a starburst, it could could be whatever you want it to be, it's your design. I'm kind of imagining it's a bit of a flower that sits by a pond, and that's why my dragonfly is attracted to it. In my head, that's how it's going. So I'm going to bring the wire back one last time towards that central coil, and then I'm going to take a slightly shorter length of wire. Normally I've been making these little prongs. These are probably about 4 millimeters out, so I'm going to make it just ever so slightly smaller when I bring that final angle back out and away. So I've got just a little sort of simplistic flower design, and I'm going to give that a little bit of a squish right now, just to give that a little bit of strength. You could, making sure that it's completely flat, obviously, making sure it's just one layer of wire, you could give that a little light hammering as well, but I think I've done enough hammering with you today. I've got 2 dogs on my feet right now, so if I sounded a bit like I jumped, they did surprise me. So I'm going to give that a squish to make sure that it's nice and strong, and I'm going to do quite a simple, just back and forth rippled design. Now you can achieve this with a standard set of round nose pliers. You, again, can take as little or as much time as you like. I'm just adding a little bit of interest up at the top of the design, but also it makes it easier for me to add my dragonfly to something that is bendy or has interest. It means that you can wind around with a lighter gauge wire just to hold everything together. When you feel like you've done enough of those little ripples, what we're going to do is go half the distance, whereby I would have put my pliers in like so and created a bend at this point. I'm not going to go all the way. I'm going to take that around about halfway across, so that when I push the line down and straight, it sits on an imaginary line coming down the centre of those ripples. Now, as I mentioned, I'm making this quite quickly today because I know that I tend to go on. My videos seem to get longer and longer every week. So let's just run through that a little bit more quickly. So I've got this little rippled design along with my little floral starburst up at the top. Now what I want to do is strengthen the straight line of my hat pin or my stick pin. Let's just get that nice and flat. Again, you could hammer this if you wanted to get a little bit of strength. Now, what I will do is I think I'll truncate this slightly to begin with. So I'm joining you back after a mild technical snafu. I recorded 20 minutes of video and it all went down the drain. So we got to around about here, and I was going to show you how you can make a very, very sharp end onto a slightly hardened wire. So in order to give that a little bit more strength, you can hammer that, but what I'm going to do is use the flat surfaces of my chain nose pliers and just get that good and strong. Now, I'm not fussed about giving that a little bit of marking. If you are, you could try to use some nylon jaw pliers, or you could even use 2 sheets of plastic to hammer that together to get a good strong section to work with. Overall, if I just give that a little bit of a tweak with a fingertip, it looks pretty strong to me. Now again, I would urge you at this juncture to try to use eye protection, please. I'm also going to show you something which I do, which I want you to just, if you're going to do it, please think very carefully. So what we need is a good pair of quality professional flush cutters, and I'm going to put them at a very, very long angle across the wire at the point I want the stick to come to an end. Please never put your fingers in between that little gap at the end there, but what I am going to do is to put one finger on one side, a thumb on the other side. These digits of mine are outside the cutting line. The reason I do this, especially if I'm just taking a very short amount off, is that I don't want this very, very pointy tail of wire to end up going somewhere awful. So let's please protect our eyes, but also protect our fingers. So you need to put a little bit more pressure on a piece like this because you're cutting far more surface of the wire. And if I just show you that very, very carefully, you'll see that that's quite a glinty, pointy, horrid little thing. So keep it away from children and pets. This is a design which is just kind of a get you out of trouble kind of thing. It gives you quite a nice sharp point. Now, I did have a file on my desk which has since gone missing, and what I would do is apply the file to the angle I've just cut and move it down and away from me to get that as smooth as possible whilst retaining an element of sharpness. That gives you your ring, sorry, I've called it a ring stick, I keep doing that. It's not a ring stick, it's a hat stick or a hat pin. That's what I'm going for. So once you've given that a little bit of a smoothing, and you can use those very, very inexpensive 4-sided buffers. So use the hardest side, which is the file section, and just get that nice and smooth. Keep it away from small people and those with limited mobility perhaps. And then you've got yourself a pin to work with. So naturally enough, in the last video I already attached the wire dragonfly I'd made to the ring stick we made together. I've called it ring stick again. Wow. Oh dear me. So I'm going to show you again now how to add your wire dragonfly to your stick, whether it's a hat pin or a hat stick, doesn't really matter. Now I have a piece of scrap wire. This is 0.4 or 26 gauge. The way that we need to work with this is to take the centre of your scrap wire. It's probably only about 6 inches in length. And I'm going to take that to the stick that we're going to work with. That's quite good fun. And in the centre of my scrap wire, I'm going to wrap around about 5 times onto my chosen stick, keeping this pointy bit away from myself because ow. And I've now got 2 sections of that finer gauge wire going in opposite directions. That gives me something to grip on with that dragonfly. So let's have a look. What I tend to do is just line that up first of all and see where I think looks good. Now I quite like that going across at an angle. It could be slightly higher. I think that looks better actually. So the reason for having the 2 ends of that finer gauge wire is if you attach by only one position, your dragonfly will rotate. If you use 2 points of attachment, the dragonfly is likely to stay much more located where you want that to be. So what I'm going to do now is to bring the tail of one end of that finer gauge wire and just find an access point. So I'm going to draw the wire all the way around both the dragonfly at whatever point works for me and the hat stick. I have been calling it ring stick an awful lot today, I apologise for that. And I'm going to rotate at least 3 times around both the dragonfly and the pin. So let's give that a really good squish, get that nice and tight. Let's find those fine tipped pliers and just tighten up that coil. If it goes horribly wrong, undo it and start again, because it's really annoying to spend all this time making lovely jewellery and then to just phone it in on the last little bit. So I think I'll probably go round actually one more time to make sure that my dragonfly is well and truly attached. If that doesn't look right, you can just go for the 3 wraps. So I'm going to finish off now by wrapping 5 times around the dragonfly's wing. If you prefer, you can obviously put that onto the stick instead. It's really your design, so however you think that's going to look prettiest. Now you'll see that I'm ending up with a little tail of scrap wire here. If I wanted to, I could use that to add some beads into this wing. I'm not going to teach that tutorial today, so I'm going to truncate the wire just past where it goes over the top of that little design for the wing, and I'm going to then smooth that down neatly. Now as I mentioned, if you just use 1 point of attachment, the dragonfly will rotate. So let's scooch him along a little bit. And then we're going to use the other end of the wire to attach on the other side. And what that will do is it will get that dragonfly sitting neatly and statically. Now it could be good fun to have them mobile. What I tend to find is that it just means that your wire will get weakened. So finer gauge wire is great if it's nice and taut. I think that actually looks quite nice at that angle, so that's what I'm going to go for. And we need to go all the way around the stick a couple of times, all the way around the stick and the wing. So I'm going to draw the tail of that finer gauge wire all the way around the stick as well. And then I'm going to finish off again with probably 5 rotations just around the wing. If you prefer to put it on the stick instead, that's absolutely fine. It's really whatever works for you. You might not want to have any wire weaving going around the dragonfly wing at all, and that's absolutely fine. It's totally up to you how you want that to look. So let's just bring that tail of wire up and trim away neatly. making sure that there aren't any loose bits at all. So let's just pop that down on the board. You might prefer to have the dragonfly's head end slightly further away from the flower. Another thing you can do is just bend the flower slightly, bearing in mind we strengthened this point here, which means that you no longer really have flexibility at that point. But this section up here is very, very gently put together, so you can, if you want to, have just a little bit of fun with that end of the design. And then you've got this pre-hardened, very, very sharp and pointy. Please keep away from small people and pets. You've got a series of dragonfly hat pins or hat sticks. Again, you could use them as brooches if you wish to, but there's a whole cluster of them there for inspiration. Well, despite the slight technical hitch today, and I hope that you still managed to find the video run smoothly, I've had a lot of fun creating a whole host of dragonflies on very pointy sticks. So as I mentioned before, please do proceed with caution with that very, very pointy part of the design. I hope you enjoy the wire dragonflies. I know that I love making these guys. I've been making them for donkey's years. Please also see my much older video from a couple of years ago where I make these wire beaded dragonflies, which also, as you can probably tell, I really enjoyed doing. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the content, and I look forward to seeing you again very, very soon. Bye for now.